They're sending us a girl. Major Blake Harrison threw the radio slip onto the map table and laughed straight into the faces of 40 exhausted men. We got Marines bleeding out on that ridge, our comms are collapsing, and headquarters answers by shipping us some quiet little thing carrying a rifle case. That's their idea of help. That's their idea of a warrior. He kicked an ammo crate across the tent so hard it split. Send her back. Tell them we don't have time to babysit. Send a real warrior. Before we go any further, if you believe the person everyone underestimates can become the one who carries everybody home, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and follow this story and all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me the city where you are watching from tonight so I can see just how far this story has traveled across the world. Part 1. The command tent smelled like burnt coffee, old sweat and fear that nobody would say out loud. Major Blake Harrison stood at the head of the map table with his fists pressed against the wood, and the men around him watched him the way soldiers watch a fire that might jump the line. He had a reputation built over 18 years, 3 deployments and more firefights than most of them had birthdays. When Harrison laughed, men laughed with him. When Harrison doubted, men doubted too. That was the danger of him, and nobody understood it better than Colonel Daniel Brooks, who stood in the corner with his arms folded and his jaw set like concrete. Blake, Brooks said quietly, lower your voice. Why? Harrison turned. So the men can keep pretending everything's fine, sir. We've got 14 Marines pinned in a collapsing position 4 kilometers north. Their ammunition is almost gone. 2 of them are wounded. Our best shooters got pulled off the line this morning because their rifles are useless in that terrain, and now the sun's going down. And you're telling me the miracle from headquarters is a captain nobody's ever heard of driving in from the dark with a case and no team? That's what I'm telling you. Then headquarters has lost its mind. Captain Mason Callahan, the operations officer, sat at the radio bench and said nothing. He was the youngest man in the tent to hold real authority, and he had learned a long time ago that the best way to survive a room with Blake Harrison in it was to be useful and quiet. But his hands were shaking as he adjusted the dials because for the last 6 hours he had been listening to the voices of the trapped Marines, and those voices had begun to change. At first they had been sharp, tactical, controlled. Now they were something else. Now they were the voices of men who had started doing the math on how the night would end. Callahan, Brooks said, what's Echo 7's arrival time? Any minute, sir. Harrison snorted. Echo 7. They gave her a call sign like she's a legend. You know what I think? I think somebody upstairs owes somebody a favor, and we're the ones paying for it. You don't know that, Brooks said. I know soldiers, Colonel. I've been reading them my whole life. I can tell you inside of 10 seconds whether a man belongs on a battlefield or whether he's going to freeze the second the shooting starts. And I'm telling you, when I see a stranger walk into this tent carrying nothing but a rifle case and a blank face, I already know how this ends. That was the moment the flap of the tent pulled back and the night air came in and a woman stepped through it. She was not what any of them expected, and every man in the room reacted to that gap between expectation and reality in his own private way. Some looked at her boots, some looked at the case in her hand, some looked at her face waiting for the fear or the arrogance or the eagerness that always came off new arrivals like heat off a road. But there was nothing. She stood there for a second and she wasn't looking at any of them. She had tilted her head slightly toward the north, toward the far-off stutter of gunfire rolling down out of the mountains, and she was listening to it the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. Captain Evelyn Carter, she said, reporting. Harrison let the silence stretch, and then he smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Captain Carter, he said, you have any idea what you walked into? I heard the situation on the way in. You heard the situation. He crossed his arms. Let me make sure the situation is clear to you, because the last thing I need tonight is somebody who doesn't understand the stakes. We have 14 Marines 4 clicks north in a forward position that's coming apart around them. We have an enemy force that showed up out of nowhere 6 hours ago and started chewing them to pieces. We've tried 3 approaches to reinforce. All 3 got turned back. We are running out of daylight ammunition and options. So before you set that case down and start telling us what you can do, I'd love to hear you explain what makes you the person they sent. Evelyn looked at him. She did not blink, and she did not rush, and she did not do the thing that everybody in that tent was braced for her to do, which was to defend herself. They didn't send me to explain. And, she said, they sent me to help. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters right now. Somebody in the back of the tent made a low breath that was almost a laugh, and Harrison's neck went red. Brooks stepped forward before it could turn into something worse. "Captain Carter," Brooks said. "I'm Colonel Brooks. I run this operation. Major Harrison is my operations lead, and I trust his judgment. So if he's got hard questions, they come from a real place. But we don't have time to fight each other. What do you need?" For the first time, Evelyn's eyes moved. They went across the map, across the radio, bench, across the drone feeds, glowing on the far monitor, and then they stopped, and they stayed on Callahan, on the headset around his neck. "I need the radio recordings," she said. Harrison blinked. "The what?" "The recordings of the trapped unit, every transmission from the last 6 hours. Not the reports, not the summaries, the actual voices." "We have drone footage," Harrison said. "We have thermal, we have satellite passes, we have an intelligence cell that's been working this problem all afternoon, and you want to sit down and listen to a bunch of scared kids yelling into a handset?" "Yes." "Why?" Evelyn set the rifle case down against the leg of the table, slow and careful, like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. "Because your drones show you where the enemy is," she said. "The voices will tell me what the enemy is thinking." The tent went quiet in a different way. Callahan felt the change before he understood it. Harrison opened his mouth to fire back, and no words came out, and that in itself was so unusual that two of the younger men glanced at each other. Brooks studied the woman a moment longer, and then he made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Callahan," he said, "give her the recordings." Callahan pulled the headset off his neck and held it out, and as she took it, her fingers were steady and his were not, and both of them noticed. She sat down at the bench without another word, and she closed her eyes and she started to listen. For 11 minutes, nobody in the command tent spoke. It was the longest 11 minutes of Mason Callahan's life. He had spent his whole afternoon inside those transmissions, and he had heard them as a rising tide of desperation. He had heard Sergeant Ruiz calling for support that couldn't come. He had heard the two wounded men in the background. He had heard the fear climbing minute by minute until the last hour of tape was almost unbearable to sit through. But Evelyn Carter didn't listen to it the way he had. She listened to it the way a musician listens to a song she is about to play back from memory. Her lips moved sometimes silently, and once she rewound a stretch of tape and listened to the same 40 seconds 3 times, and each time her expression changed by a degree so small that only a person watching very closely would have caught it. Harrison was watching very closely. He didn't like what he was seeing, and he liked even less that he couldn't say why. "This is a waste of time," he muttered to Brooks, but quietly now because even his own certainty had thinned. Then Evelyn opened her eyes. "Play me the map," she said. "Last 6 hours, every position the trapped unit has held in order." Callahan pulled up the timeline. He had built it himself, and he was proud of it, and he clicked through it position by position while she watched. First position, the original forward outpost. Second position, after the first push 40 meters east into a rock draw. Third position, after the second push further east and slightly downhill. Fourth position, where they were now a shallow depression at the base of a ridge with only one exposed avenue of retreat. She watched the whole thing without a word. Then she asked him to play it again. Then she asked him to play it a third time. "Captain," Harrison said, and his patience was a thread now, "if you don't have something, I need to stop wasting fuel and start planning a fourth rescue attempt, because those men do not have time for you to watch a slideshow." Evelyn didn't turn around. She reached out and put one finger on the map on that final position, the shallow depression at the base of the ridge. "Your men think they're being pushed," she said. "They're not being pushed. They're being led." The words landed in the tent like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripple of it reached every man there. "Say that again," Brooks said. She stood up. She moved to the table, and now everyone was looking at the map through her finger. "For 6 hours, everyone in this tent has believed the same thing. That the enemy showed up, hit the outpost hard, and has been overwhelming your Marines with superior numbers ever since. Push after push, position after position, driving them back. That's the story your drones tell you. That's the story the reports tell you. And it's wrong." "It's not wrong," Harrison said. "I've watched it happen with my own eyes." "You watched them move," Evelyn said. "You didn't ask why they moved where they moved." She traced the 4 positions in order, slow, deliberate. "Look at the sequence. First position the outpost, then east and down, then here the base of the ridge, 4 positions, 4 displacements, and every single one of them takes your men closer to this exact spot. Her fingertips settled on the shallow depression and stayed there. 4 times the enemy could have surrounded them. 4 times the enemy could have closed the ring and finished it. And 4 times the enemy left one door open, and every single time that open door pointed here. Callahan felt something cold move down his spine. He pulled up the drone thermal from an hour ago, and he looked at it now the way she was telling him to look at it, and his mouth went dry. "She's right," he whispered. "Sir, look, every push, there's always a gap. There's always one way out, and it always," he stopped, "it always sends them the same direction." "Coincidence," Harrison said, but the word came out with no weight behind it. 14 soldiers, Evelyn said, over 6 hours, under fire the entire time, and they have moved in a straight line as clean as a chalk mark. That's not what a running man does, Major. A running man scatters. A running man goes where the fire isn't, and the fire changes, so his path bends and doubles and breaks. Your men's path doesn't bend. Somebody drew it for them. The tent was silent again, and this time the silence had a texture to it, thick and electric, because a truth was being born in that room, and every man there could feel the shape of it, even before he understood it. Harrison was the last to break. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned in, and his voice was low now, stripped of the mockery. "All right," he said. "Say I believe you. Say somebody is herding my men into that depression on purpose. Why, what's waiting for them there that isn't waiting for them anywhere else?" Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time since she'd walked into the tent, there was something almost like respect in the way she answered him, because it was the right question, and she knew it, and she wanted him to know she knew it. "That's what I've been listening for," she said, "and I think I found it. Play the transmission from 94 minutes ago. There's a moment about 11 seconds in where Sergeant Ruiz stops talking mid-sentence." Callahan found it. He knew the moment. It had unnerved him the first time he'd heard it. He played it now. They all heard it together. Ruiz's voice tight and clipped, calling in a position update. And then right in the middle of a word, he stopped. There was a beat of pure dead air. And then Ruiz's voice came back lower, more careful, saying something none of them had thought much about at the time. "Somebody's watching us. I can feel it. Somebody's up high and they are watching every move we make." Everybody heard that and wrote it off as nerves, Evelyn said. "Osvam." "It wasn't nerves. He's right. There's an observer. One man somewhere elevated with eyes on your entire unit feeding corrections to the fighters below. That's how the herd stays so clean. Every time your Marines drift off the intended line, the observer sees it and the fire shifts to correct them. The soldiers doing the shooting aren't the brains of this. They're the fence. He's the shepherd. And he has been standing over your men for 6 hours, and nobody in this tent has looked for him because everybody's been looking at the sheep." Nobody spoke. Then Harrison said very quietly, "Where is he?" And Evelyn Carter almost smiled. "That's the beautiful part," she said. "He's made one mistake. To do what he's doing, he needs to see everything. Every position, every gap, the outpost and the depression, and every meter in between. There's only a handful of places on that terrain with that kind of view. And the closer I look at the timing of the corrections, the faster they come when your men move in one particular direction, which means he's got a blind angle. There's one slope he can't see, and that slope is on the western side near the old observation tower." The name landed and Harrison's face changed. "No," he said, "absolutely not." "Major, you don't understand what you're asking. That tower was abandoned for a reason. It's a death sentence. Half the structure came down in a shelling 2 years ago. It's exposed on 3 sides. The stairs are gone. Anyone who climbs up there is a target the size of a barn, and there is no cover, and there is no way down that isn't slow. We wrote that position off the map, Captain. We don't use it, and the enemy doesn't use it, and there's a reason for both." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm counting on it." "You're counting on it," Harrison repeated like he couldn't believe the words. "Your enemy's observer built his entire operation on a map of what's dangerous and what's safe, and he built it correctly because he's good. He knows nobody sane would use that tower, so he's not watching it. He can't watch everything, and that's the one place he decided he'd never have to. Every assumption he made about what's too dangerous is exactly the assumption I'm going to walk through." She looked at Harrison steadily. You told me an hour ago you can read a soldier in 10 seconds. So read me now. Am I afraid of that tower? Harrison looked at her a long moment, and he could not find it. He had spent 18 years learning to see fear in the small places where men hide it. The jaw, the hands, the eyes, the pulse in the throat, and he looked for it now in Evelyn Carter, and it was not there. And the absence of it disturbed him more than any bravado ever could have. No, he admitted, you're not. Then let me do my job. Brooks stepped in. Carter walked me through it. You go up the tower, you find the observer. What then? You've got no cover. If he's watching that direction even for a second, you're dead before you set up. He won't be watching that direction. That's the whole plan. He spent 6 hours training himself to ignore it. But even if I'm wrong about that, it doesn't matter because I'm not going up there to survive a duel. I'm going up there because from that tower on that western slope, I will be able to see him before he can see me. And the moment I can see him, this stops being a battle and starts being a math problem. You're going to take one man out of a firefight, Harrison said, and you think that ends it. I'm going to take the one man who is running the whole thing, Evelyn said. There's a difference between killing a soul and cutting the strings on a puppet. Your enemy down there isn't 14 independent thinkers. They're a machine, and the observer is the mind of it. Remove the mind, and the machine doesn't just get weaker. It gets confused. It starts making decisions locally without the God's eye view it's been leaning on for 6 hours. And the second it does that, your Marines stop being sheep in a pen and start being 14 armed Americans who suddenly have room to breathe. Callahan realized he was leaning forward with his whole body, and he wasn't the only one. How long do you need? Brooks asked. To get into position, if nobody's shooting at me, 20 minutes. If somebody is longer or never. But there's a second problem. She turned back to the map. Right now, the observer is keeping your men in a slow squeeze. He's not finishing them because he doesn't have to. But the moment I'm in position and I take that shot, the machine breaks, and machines that break don't fail quietly. There's going to be a window 60 seconds, maybe 90, where the enemy fighters realize they've lost their eyes and they panic. And panicked men with rifles are more dangerous than calm ones for exactly that long. So the second I fire, your trapped unit cannot sit still. They have to move, hard, in the right direction, or the window closes and it was all for nothing. They're exhausted, Callahan said. They've been under fire for 6 hours. 2 of them are wounded. You're asking men who can barely hold a rifle to sprint on a whistle. I'm asking them to fight for their lives one more time, Evelyn said, which is exactly what they've been doing all day. The only difference is that this time, for the first time, the fight will actually be winnable. And I need them to believe that before I ever pull the trigger, because a man moves like he's already dead right up until the moment he decides he isn't. Brooks looked at Harrison. It was a look with a whole conversation buried in it, 18 years of trust and command and hard nights, and Harrison held it. And something passed between them. Brooks said, it's your call on the rescue coordination. She takes the shot, your men on the ground have to move. Can you run that? Harrison was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map. He looked at the tower. He looked last at Evelyn Carter, at the woman he had mocked in front of 40 men not 30 minutes ago, and there was a war going on behind his eyes that was every bit as real as the one on the ridge. I've been wrong before, he said finally. I've been wrong plenty, but I have never been wrong the way I might be wrong tonight. He straightened. Yeah, I can run it. Callahan, get me a channel to Ruiz. Clean as you can make it. If we're going to ask those men to run on a signal, they need to hear it from someone they trust. And right now, the only voice they trust is the one that's been on the other end of that handset for 6 hours. That's me, Callahan said. Then that's you. God help us. Evelyn had already moved to the case. She knelt beside it and she opened it, and Callahan, who had seen a lot of weapons in his time, felt his breath catch. The rifle inside was a .50 caliber, long and heavy, and serious, the kind of weapon that changed the physics of a battlefield. But it wasn't the weapon that stopped him. It was her hands. She assembled it the way other people breathe, without looking, without hesitating, each piece finding its place with a soft mechanical certainty, and she did it while she was still talking, so that the assembling and the planning happened in the same calm current. One more thing, she said, not looking up. Nobody radios me once I'm in position. Not to check in, not to wish me luck, not for anything. The observer might not be watching that slope, but if there's a burst of radio traffic pointed at a dead tower, that's a flare in the dark. From the moment I leave this tent, I am off the net. You will not hear from me again until you hear the shot. And if something goes wrong, Callahan asked. She clicked the final piece home and looked up at him. Then you'll hear that too, she said. Just not the way you want to. Harrison surprised everyone, including himself. He walked around the table and he stood in front of her and he put out his hand. Captain Carter, he said, 30 minutes ago I said something in this tent that I'm not proud of. I called you a lot of things you didn't earn in front of men who follow my lead. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, but I'm going to tell you the truth instead. I don't understand how you did what you just did with a headset and a map. I've been doing this 18 years and I looked at the same information you did and I saw a losing fight and you saw a puzzle with the solution. So whatever you are, wherever they built you, I was wrong about it, and I'd rather admit that now than after. Evelyn looked at his hand, then she took it. You weren't protecting your ego, Major, she said. You were protecting your men. You looked at a stranger and you didn't want their lives in the hands of someone you couldn't vouch for. That's not a flaw. That's the job. She released his hand. You were wrong about me, but you were right to be careful. Hold on to both of those. You'll need them again someday and not always in that order. For a moment, Harrison had no answer, which was in itself a kind of history being made. Brooks broke it. Carter, before you go, I have to ask you something, and I need the real answer, not the comfortable one. He came around the table. The men out there, if your read is wrong, if there's no observer, if this whole thing is exactly what it looks like, and you climb that tower for nothing, then we've spent 20 minutes we didn't have, and one of the only shooters we've got left is stranded on a ruin. So I need to know, how sure are you? The tent held its breath. Evelyn slung the .50 caliber across her back, and she picked up nothing else. No pack, no extra gear, nothing but the weapon and herself. And she looked at Colonel Brooks with an expression that was neither arrogant nor uncertain, but something rarer than both, which was the look of a person who has already checked their work. Colonel, she said, I've been listening to your men die by inches for 6 hours on that tape. I heard a sergeant stop in the middle of a sentence because he felt eyes on the back of his neck. I heard 14 men walk a straight line through chaos that should have scattered them a dozen different ways. I heard corrections come faster from one direction than another, over and over, until the pattern was as loud to me as a bell. I am not guessing. I am not hoping. I have listened to the enemy think, and I know exactly what he's thinking, because he is very good and very smart and very careful, and he has made exactly one mistake, which is that he believes the only people who can beat him are the ones who look like they can. She moved toward the tent flap. He built his whole trap on that belief, she said, and I am going to walk into it through the one door he was sure nobody would use. That's not a percentage, Brooks said. No, Evelyn agreed. It's better than a percentage, it's certainty. She stopped at the flap. She looked back once and her eyes went across all of them, the young ones and the old ones, the believers and the doubters, Callahan with his shaking hands, and Harrison with his newfound silence, and Brooks with his concrete jaw. Get your men ready to run, she said. When it's time, they won't have long to decide whether they trust me. Make sure they've already made up their minds before the shot, because after the shot, there won't be time to think. And then she was gone, out into the dark, and the flap fell shut behind her, and the tent felt suddenly emptier than a single person leaving should have made it feel. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Then Callahan turned back to the radio, and his hands weren't shaking anymore, and he keyed the handset. Ruiz, he said, this is base. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to trust me, because I'm about to ask you and your men to do the hardest thing I've ever asked anybody to do. The voice that came back was cracked and hollowed out by 6 hours of hell, but it was still there, still fighting. Base, this is Ruiz. We're still here. Barely. What have you got? Callahan looked at Harrison. Harrison nodded. Help's coming, Callahan said. Not the way you're expecting. Not more men, not more birds. One person. And I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. But I need you to hear me, Sergeant. Everything you're feeling out there, the sense that you're being pushed, the feeling that somebody's watching you, the way every escape route keeps funneling you into that hole at the base of the ridge, all of it is real, and somebody finally figured out why. There was a pause on the line. When Ruiz spoke again, his voice had changed. There was something in it that hadn't been there a minute before, and it took Callahan a second to name it, and when he did, his throat tightened, because the thing in Ruiz's voice was hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing you could hand a dying man, because if you were wrong, you didn't just lose him. You broke him first. Say again, Base, Ruiz said. Somebody figured it out. Somebody figured it out, Callahan confirmed, and she's on her way to fix it. I need you to hold. I need you to conserve every round you've got. I need you to keep your men calm and keep them low. And when I give you the word, when you hear a shot come from somewhere those people are absolutely not expecting. From high up on the western side, I need every man who can move to move and move hard, and I'll tell you exactly which way. Can you do that, Sergeant? Another pause. In the background, faintly, Callahan could hear one of the wounded men and the flat cracking of enemy rounds against rock, and under all of it, the terrible patient rhythm of a squeeze that had been tightening for 6 hours. Base, Ruiz said finally. Who is she? Harrison leaned toward the handset before Callahan could answer. He didn't take it. He just spoke loud enough for the mic to catch him, and his voice, the voice that had mocked her in front of the whole tent, was steady and clear. Sergeant, this is Major Harrison. I'll tell you exactly who she is, and I'll tell you as a man who was dead wrong about her 30 minutes ago. So you know I'm not selling you anything. She's the person who listened to 6 hours of you and your men and heard something the rest of us missed. She's the one who found the thing that's been killing you before it could finish the job. I don't know where the Corps keeps people like her son, and I don't care. All I know is that in 18 years, I have never watched anybody read a battlefield the way she just read yours. So when I tell you to trust her, I'm telling you as somebody who spent his whole career learning not to trust easy. Hold your position, save your rounds, and when the shot comes, you run like she's already earned it, because she has. The line was quiet for a 3 count. Then Ruiz said in a voice that had found something to hold on to. Copy that, Base. We'll hold. Tell her. He stopped. Tell her we've got 14 reasons to make it worth her while. Callahan set the handset down and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 6 hours. On the map in the dark, somewhere on a western slope, nobody was supposed to walk a woman with a .50 caliber rifle across her back, and the whole plan of the enemy laid out in her mind was moving toward a ruined tower, silent and unafraid, carrying the lives of 14 men she had never met, and the pride of one man who would never forget her climbing toward the single shot that was about to turn 6 hours of certain death into a chance nobody in that tent had believed in an hour before. Least of all the major, who had thrown a radio slip on the table and demanded they send a real warrior instead. The whole command post had gone still. Every man had found something to look at: the map, the monitors, the floor, and every man was doing the same private thing, which was praying in whatever way a soldier prays, wordless and pointed north toward a stranger who had walked into their war, carrying almost nothing, and had already, without firing a single round, given them back the one thing the enemy had spent 6 hours taking away, which was the belief that this night could end anyway but the way it had been heading. Brooks looked at the map a long time. Then he spoke quietly to no one and everyone. 18 years I've watched people underestimate the wrong soldier, he said. It never stops being a mistake, and it never stops surprising the ones who make it. Harrison didn't answer. He was staring at the western slope on the map, at the little symbol for the tower they had all written off as a grave, and he was thinking about the moment she'd asked him to read her, to look for the fear, the way he'd looked for it in 1,000 men before, and how for the first time in his career, the thing he was so certain he'd find simply wasn't there. Callahan, he said at last without turning. How long since she left the tent? Callahan checked. 9 minutes, sir. 9 minutes. Harrison closed his eyes for a second. 9 minutes ago, I still thought I was the smartest man in this operation. He opened them again, and something in his face had settled into a hard, clean resolve. Get me every unit we've got that can support that push. Stage them, brief them, and keep them absolutely silent until the shot. When she pulls that trigger, I want this whole valley to move at once, and I want it to move so fast that the enemy never gets that 90-second window she warned us about. She's giving us a door. We are not going to be the reason it slams shut. Yes, sir. The tent came alive around them, quiet and coordinated men moving with the particular focus of soldiers who have stopped doubting and started believing. And it was a strange thing, Callahan thought, how belief could change a room. An hour ago, they had all been waiting to lose, Now they were preparing to win, and the only thing that had changed, the only new fact in the world, was that a woman nobody recognized had walked in out of the dark, listened to the truth in the voices of dying men, and told them the enemy could be beaten. Somewhere to the north, the gunfire rolled on, patient and cruel, a machine grinding down 14 exhausted Marines who had just been told, against all the evidence, of 6 brutal hours that help was coming, in a form none of them expected, from a direction none of them would have looked, in the hands of a person the enemy had never once considered a threat. And in the darkness, on the western slope, moving toward the tower, with a stillness that had unsettled every man who'd watched her, Evelyn Carter climbed toward her position off the net, alone, the whole plan of a very good enemy, folded neatly in her mind, carrying the certainty she'd promised the colonel, the certainty that was better than a percentage, the certainty of a person who had already checked her work and found the one flaw in a perfect trap. The observer down below had built everything on a single belief, that the only people who could beat him were the ones who looked like they could. He was about to learn how wrong a smart man could be. And the man who had stood in a command tent and demanded a real warrior was about to watch one climb a ruined tower with nothing but a rifle and a truth, and hold the line the enemy had thought no one would ever dare to hold. The climb up the western slope should have taken 20 minutes. It took Evelyn Carter 34, and every extra minute was a decision she made on purpose. She moved the way a person moves when they have decided that being alive at the top matters more than being fast to it. She did not take the obvious line. The obvious line was the shortest, and the shortest line was the one a smart enemy would have watched, even while telling himself he didn't need to, because smart men hedge their certainties, and the observer down there was very smart. So Evelyn took the longer way, the crueler way, the one that ran through loose rock in a stretch of open ground, where a single careless silhouette against the dying light would have ended everything before it began. She crossed that open ground on her stomach, one forearm at a time, the .50 caliber dragging beside her like a second body, and she counted her own heartbeats to keep herself slow, because the enemy of a person in her position was never the terrain. It was the impatience the terrain bred. Back in the command tent 4 kilometers south, Mason Callahan watched a clock he could not do anything about. 31 minutes, he said. Nobody had asked. He just needed to say it out loud to make the waiting into something with a number attached, because a number felt like control and the silence did not. Harrison stood over the map with his arms crossed and his jaw working. He had staged 3 support elements in the folds of ground south of the ridge, briefed them, and put them on a hair trigger. And then he had done the hardest thing a man like him could do, which was nothing. There was nothing left to arrange. Every piece was where it needed to be. Now it all came down to a woman on a slope and a shot that hadn't happened. And Blake Harrison, who had spent 18 years believing that outcomes belonged to the men who took hold of them, was learning what it felt like to have his hands empty at the most important moment of a battle. She said no radio, Callahan said mostly to himself. She said we wouldn't hear from her until the shot. I know what she said. I just want to make sure she's still moving, Harrison said. If she were dead, the shooting to the north would change. It hasn't, which means the observer hasn't seen her, which means she's still doing exactly what she said she'd do, which is get into a position we all told her was suicide through a door that lunatic down there swears nobody would use. He exhaled through his nose. Keep your eyes on Ruiz's channel. When she fires, that window opens, and it opens for 90 seconds, and I am not going to be the reason those men are half a step slow. On the ridge, the 14 were holding. Sergeant Diego Ruiz had them low and quiet in the depression at the base of the ridge, the exact hole the enemy had spent 6 hours herding them into, and now that he knew it was a trap, being inside, it was almost unbearable. He kept the knowledge off his face because he had 11 men still capable of fighting, and 2 who weren't, and all 13 of the ones who were conscious were watching him for the truth, reading it off him the way soldiers always read their sergeant, and if he let them see how thin the thread was, the thread would snap. Boyd, he said quietly, how's your ammo? 2 mags, Sergeant. Maybe 40 rounds. Boyd was 19. He'd been 20 for about 6 hours, in the sense that 6 hours in a place like this aged a man a year. Ramirez has more. He's been rationing since noon. Good. Everybody rations from here. Nobody fires unless they've got a body in their sights. We are not spending one more round keeping their heads down. We spend rounds on kills, or we don't spend them at all. Copy, Sergeant. Ruiz crawled to where Hollis lay. Hollis was the worst of the two wounded hit in the hip early in the third hour, and he'd been white and drifting for a while now, and every time Ruiz checked him, he was a little more gone, and there was nothing to be done about it except keep him alive 1 minute longer, and then one more, and then one more until the shot came. If the shot came, if the woman on the slope was real and not a story, headquarters told to keep them fighting. Hollis, stay with me. Hollis's eyes tracked toward him slow. Sergeant, that true what Base said? His voice was a whisper with the bottom scraped out of it. Somebody figured it out. That's what they said. One person. Ruiz hesitated. He had been a sergeant long enough to know that a lie could carry a man across a gap that the truth couldn't, and long enough to hate that it was true. But he looked at Hollis and he decided that this man had earned honesty over comfort. One person, he said, a captain. And Major Harrison got on the net and vouched for her and Hollis. I've been doing this a while and I have never once heard Harrison vouch for anybody. That man doesn't hand out trust. So if he's spending it on her, then whoever she is, she's the real thing. You hold on until she does what she came to do, and I will personally carry you off this ridge. You hear me? Personally. Hollis's mouth moved into something that wanted to be a smile. You're too small to carry me, Sergeant. Then I'll drag you. Same result. Stay with me. 29 minutes into the climb, Evelyn reached the base of the tower. It was worse than the map had promised. Half of it had come down in the shelling 2 years before, and what remained was a broken tooth of concrete and rusted rebar canted and cracked with the interior stairs sheared off at the second level so that the top of the structure was reachable only by climbing the exposed skeleton of the thing itself. Anyone watching this side of the valley would see a person doing that climb the way you'd see a fly walking up a white wall. It was exactly as Harrison had said, a death sentence. Unless nobody was watching, which was the entire bet. Evelyn stood at the base for 11 full seconds and did nothing but listen to the north, to the rhythm of the enemy's fire the same way she'd listened to it when she stepped out of the vehicle a lifetime ago. She had spent those 34 minutes not just climbing, but studying, cataloging the sound of the battle, learning its heartbeat, and she knew that heartbeat now, the way she knew her own. If the observer had seen her, the rhythm would shift. There would be a redirect, a change in the tempo of the corrections, the machine reacting to a new variable. She listened for it. The rhythm held, patient, cruel, unchanged. He hadn't seen her. She was a variable he had decided didn't exist. She started to climb. 33 minutes, Callahan said, and this time his voice cracked on it. Steady, Harrison said, but there was nothing steady in the tent. Every man in it was staring at the northern feed in the timeline and the silent western slope where a symbol on a map represented a woman doing something none of them could see. Brooks had come to stand beside Callahan, and the colonel's concrete jaw had a muscle in it that was jumping now, and even that small crack in his composure did more to unsettle the young men than any words could have, because if the colonel was scared, then it was permitted to be scared. The climb up the skeleton of the tower took Evelyn 6 minutes that felt to her like 6 hours, and to the men in the tent like 6 years. She went up rebar slick with 2 years of weather testing, each grip, trusting nothing, the .50 caliber a dead weight across her back that tried to peel her off the structure at every reach. Halfway up a length of rebar she was pulling on gave a small grinding shift a warning, and she froze and she redistributed her weight, and she waited for her own pulse to come down before she moved again, because the tower did not care that 14 men were dying 4 kilometers away. The tower would kill her for being in a hurry, just as dead as any bullet. And then she was at the top. She pulled herself onto the cracked platform, and she lay flat, and for a moment she just breathed, and then she brought the .50 caliber off her back and around into her hands, and everything in Evelyn Carter that had been holding tension for 39 minutes went quiet all at once, like a held breath finally released, because now she was where she needed to be, and the only thing left to do was the thing she was best at in all the world. She set the rifle. She settled behind it, and she looked out over the valley, over the whole battlefield laid bare beneath her, and she began to hunt. She did not sweep the terrain frantically. She had already done the mathematics of where he had to be. There were on all of that ground exactly 3 positions, with the field of view the observer required to run what he was running, and one of them she'd known since the command tent had a blind angle on this western slope, which was why she was here. So she checked the other 2 first quickly, methodically, the way you check the doors you expect to be locked before you go to the one you expect to be open. The first position was empty. The second position was empty. And the third position, the one with the blind angle, the one he had chosen precisely because it could see everything except the direction she had come from, was not empty. There he was. He was exactly where the logic said he'd be, tucked into an elevated fold of rock, with a clean line to the whole hurting ground, and he had optics up, and he was in that very moment watching Ruiz's men in their hole. Evelyn could see the small, deliberate movements of a man doing precise work. She watched him for 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, she understood the entire architecture of the last 6 hours, because she watched him lift his head, track something below, and then make a small gesture. And half a heartbeat later, the enemy fired to the north changed, shifted, corrected, and one of Ruiz's men, who had started to drift toward a gap, was pushed back into the pen. She had been right about all of it, every word she'd said in the tent. There was the shepherd. There were the strings. And he had no idea in the world that anyone was above him and behind him with a .50 caliber and a settled heartbeat. Evelyn keyed nothing. She said nothing. She had promised the tent they wouldn't hear from her until the shot, and she kept that promise because the shot was the message. She let the crosshairs come to rest, and she made the small adjustments. Distance dropped the faint pull of the wind coming down the valley, and she did it all with a calm that would have frightened anyone watching, because it was the calm of a person for whom this was not a moment of drama, but a moment of completion. The last piece of a puzzle she had solved back in the command tent with a headset and a map. Down in the tent, Callahan's clock hit 39 minutes, and he opened his mouth to say the number, and he never got the chance, because that was when they heard it. It came rolling down out of the mountains across 4 kilometers of dark, a single enormous crack that was unlike any of the other gunfire because it was deeper, heavier, final, a sound with a full stop built into it, and every man in the command tent went rigid, and Harrison's head came up, and Callahan's hand froze over the radio, and for one suspended, unbearable second, nobody breathed, because a shot from the western slope meant one of 2 things. It meant she had done it, or it meant the observer had seen her after all, and that crack was the last sound Evelyn Carter would ever make. Then the northern feed changed. Callahan saw it happen on the thermal, and he made a sound that wasn't a word. Sir, look, the enemy positions, he pointed at the monitor with a hand that had started shaking again, but this time for a different reason entirely. They're not shifting anymore. The correction stopped. The whole rhythm just broke. Harrison was already at the screen. What he saw there he would remember for the rest of his life, and he would tell it years later to young officers who thought they understood war, and none of them ever quite believed him. He saw a machine lose its mind. For 6 hours, the enemy fire had moved with a single coordinating intelligence, every position playing its part in a larger design, the whole thing breathing as one organism. And now, in the space of a few seconds, that organism came apart. Positions that had been perfectly synchronized began firing at cross purposes. The pressure that had been squeezing Ruiz's men from 3 sides suddenly lost its shape, went slack in one place, doubled pointlessly in another. Fighters who had spent the whole engagement moving on cues from above were suddenly catastrophically on their own. The shepherd was gone, and the sheep had rifles. That's the window, Harrison breathed. Then louder, a bark that snapped the whole tent into motion. That's the window, Callahan, give Ruiz the word now. They've got 90 seconds and not a second more. Move him. Callahan had the hand set up before Harrison finished the sentence. Ruiz, this is base. The shot is fired. I say again, the shot is fired. Their eyes are gone. Go. Break east, northeast up the draw. The gap on your right is open, and it is going to stay open for about a minute, and then it slams shut forever. Move your men. Go, go, go. On the ridge, Diego Ruiz had heard the shot too. He'd heard it, and he hadn't understood it. That single deep crack from a direction that made no sense from high up on the western side, exactly like base had promised. And for 1/2 second, his mind refused it because he'd been let down before, and hope was a wound. But then he'd felt the fire change. He'd felt it the way you feel a fever break the pressure that had been leaning on them for 6 straight hours, suddenly impossibly lifting, going confused and ragged. And he was a good enough soldier to know exactly what that meant, even before Callahan's voice came screaming through the handset. Up, Ruiz roared, and there was a whole day's worth of held-back fury in it. Everybody up. We are moving east, northeast, up the draw, right now. Boyd Ramirez, you're on point. You find that gap, and you hold it open. Kessler, grab. Delgado. I've got Hollis. Move Marines. This is it. This is the one. Go, Ebo. And the 14 who had been waiting to die stood up and became 14 who were fighting to live. It should not have been possible. They were exhausted past the edge of what bodies can do. 2 of them couldn't walk. Every one of them had spent 6 hours being ground down into something that shouldn't have been able to run. But there is a fuel that lives underneath exhaustion, and it is only reachable when a man who has accepted his death is suddenly handed back his life, and every one of those Marines found it in the same instant. They came up out of the hole and they moved east, northeast toward the gap on the right, and the gap was open exactly as Base had promised, exactly as the woman on the slope had said it would be, because the enemy that had been so carefully keeping it closed had lost the mind that told it to. Ruiz got an arm under Hollis and hauled him up, and Hollis screamed, and Ruiz didn't stop because a screaming man was a living man, and he'd promised to drag him off this ridge, and that's exactly what he was going to do. Kessler had Delgado, the other wounded man, over his shoulders in a carry, and Boyd and Ramirez were at the mouth of the gap laying down disciplined, rationed, murderous fire at the enemy positions that were only now too late, starting to realize their prey had bolted. 60 seconds, Callahan called into the handset tracking the window on the thermal. Ruiz, you've got 60 seconds of confusion, then they figure it out. Keep moving. Don't stop for anything. You are halfway. Up on the tower, Evelyn Carter was not finished. She had never intended the first shot to be the only shot. Removing the observer broke the machine. Yes, but a broken machine is still full of armed men, and in the 90 seconds of chaos, she'd promised the tent. Those men would start one by one to recover their nerve, and the ones who recovered fastest would be the ones best positioned to catch Ruiz's people in the open as they ran the draw. So Evelyn had already moved off the empty fold of rock where the dead observer lay and was hunting again, and now she was hunting the recoverers, the leaders, the enemy fighters who were lifting their heads out of the confusion first and starting to understand where the Marines had gone. She found the first one at the mouth of the draw, a fighter who'd figured out the escape route faster than his fellows and was swinging a weapon to bear on Boyd and Ramirez at exactly the moment they were most exposed, holding the gap. She fired. The second crack rolled down in the valley, and in the tent, Callahan's head snapped up again, and this time he understood it instantly, and something fierce and disbelieving broke open in his chest. She's still up there, he said. Sir, she's still shooting. She's covering their run. He watched the thermal, and he watched an enemy position that had been about to become a problem for Ruiz's point men simply stop being a problem. She's clearing the draw for them. Every time somebody down there gets their act together and moves to cut off the escape, she's taking them off the board before they can do it. Harrison stood very still watching the same thing, and something moved across his weathered face that none of the young men in the tent had ever seen there before and would struggle to describe afterward. She's not just breaking the machine, he said quietly, almost to himself. She's holding the door. She fired the first shot to open it, and now she's standing on that tower, holding it open with every round in that rifle, one enemy at a time, so those men can get through. He shook his head slowly. One person, one rifle. She's holding the whole kill zone by herself. The third crack came, then 40 seconds later a fourth. Each one was another enemy fighter who had recovered his wits and moved to close the trap, and each one was another enemy fighter who never completed the movement. Because a woman 400 meters up and away on a ruined tower saw him do it and ended it before it could cost a Marine his life. She was reading the battle the same way she'd read the tape in the command tent, seeing not the chaos but the pattern inside the chaos, identifying in real time which of the scattered enemy fighters was about to become the next threat to the men in the draw, and answering each threat with a single deliberate round before it could ripen. 40 seconds, Callahan said. Ruiz status, 2/3 up the draw. Ruiz's voice came back ragged and pounding. The sound of a man running with another man's full weight. We're moving base. We are moving, but they're waking up back there. We're taking fire from... There was a burst of noise close and violent, and Callahan's heart stopped. Taking fire from the left. Somebody's got an angle on us from the left. We're pinned. We can't. She'll get him, Harrison said. And it was not a hope, it was a statement. And even as he said it, he didn't fully understand where his certainty came from, except that he had watched this woman be right about everything for the last hour, and he had run out of reasons to doubt her. Callahan, tell Ruiz to keep his men low and keep moving. She's going to clear that left angle. Tell him to trust it. Up on the tower, Evelyn had already seen it. She'd seen the enemy fighter work his way to the left flank of the draw into a position where he'd have a clean enfilade down the line of running Marines, and she'd understood in the same instant that this was the dangerous one. This was the shot that mattered most, because from that angle he could rake the whole column and turn the escape into a massacre in about 4 seconds. It was a hard shot. He was tucked in, mostly covered, moving. She had a sliver of him in a closing window and no time to do the mathematics slowly. So she did it fast, the way she'd learned to do it in places she was never allowed to talk about. And she trusted the years, and she fired. The fifth crack. On the left flank of the draw, the enemy fighter, who had been half a second from raking 14 exhausted Marines with an enfilade, simply stopped, and the angle that had pinned Ruiz's column went quiet. And Ruiz, who had been flat on the ground with Hollis and had thought for one terrible instant that they had come all this way just to die in the open, felt the fire from the left stop as suddenly as it had started. "The left's clear," he shouted, half in disbelief. "The left angle's gone base. It's somebody just up. Everybody, up. Keep moving. We are almost there. Go." "She got him," Callahan said, and his voice broke completely on it, and he didn't care. "Sir, she got the left angle. They're moving again. They're..." He watched the thermal, the little cluster of friendly signatures pouring up and out of the draw toward the high ground, where Harrison's stage support elements were waiting. "They're going to make it. Sir, they're going to make it." 20 seconds on the window, Harrison said. "Get them into the arms of that support element before it closes." Callahan, hand off to the ground commander up top. "Get those Marines behind cover. Move them the last 100 meters. The window was closing. Down in the valley, the enemy had finally fully understood what had happened to them, and their confusion was hardening back into intent. And fighters were converging on the mouth of the draw to punish the escape. But they were seconds too late, and seconds were the entire currency of this thing. And the reason they were too late had a name, and the name was Evelyn Carter. And she was up on a tower they'd all sworn nobody would ever use, spending the last of her window making sure the enemy stayed seconds too late. And then Ruiz's lead man crested the top of the draw, and Harrison's support element rose up out of the folds of ground where they'd been waiting silent for 40 minutes. And they opened up over the heads of the running Marines and into the faces of the pursuing enemy, and the whole balance of the valley, which had belonged so completely to the enemy, for 6 hours tipped in a single violent instant into something else. The 14 came up out of the draw and into friendly lines. All 14, the 12 who could run, and the 2 who were carried, Reese still with Hollis. Kessler still with Delgado, Boyd, and Ramirez last through the gap, with their weapons still up and their last rounds still going, and they crossed into cover and safety. And the arms of men who grabbed them and pulled them down and behind rock, and the sound that went up from the support element was not a cheer. It was something rougher and more animal than a cheer. The sound men make when they have watched something they were sure would end in death, end in life instead. In the command tent 4 kilometers south, Mason Callahan put both hands flat on the radio bench and lowered his head and did not say anything for a long moment, because there was nothing in his training that had prepared him for what to do when the thing you had been certain would be a tragedy turned in the space of 90 seconds into the other thing. "All 14, he finally said, his voice unsteady. "Colonel Major, all 14 are across. Both wounded are alive. Ruiz reports he's got his whole unit behind the support elements line, and they are consolidating." He lifted his head. They made it. Every single one of them made it. The tent did not erupt. It was too tired for that and too aware of how close the other outcome had been. What happened instead was quieter and in its way larger. Men who had been holding themselves rigid for hours let their shoulders come down. Somebody sat down heavily on an ammo crate and put his face in his hands. Brooks, whose concrete jaw had held it all night, closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were bright, and he did not try to hide it, because a man who's led long enough learns there's no shame in it. And Harrison stood in the middle of it and looked at the western slope on the map, at the little symbol for the tower. And he was not thinking about the 14 who'd been saved. Not yet. That would come later. Right now, he was thinking about the woman on that tower, and a question was rising in him that he almost didn't want to ask, because the answer to it lived in the silence on the net that she had promised them, the silence that was supposed to break only with her shots. The shots had stopped. He counted they backward in his head. 5 shots. The observer. Then 4 more, each one clearing the draw, each one taking an enemy off the board before he could close the trap. 5 shots and then the support element had risen up and the Marines had crossed to safety and the battle had turned. And since that moment, since the 5th crack rolled down out of the mountains, there had been nothing from the western slope. No 6th shot and no word. Because she was off the net. Because she'd told them she'd stay off the net until it was done. But it was done now. Wasn't it, Callahan? Harrison said, and something in his voice made the whole tent go still again. Raise Captain Carter. Callahan blinked. She said no radio until... It's over. The men are across. The window's closed. There's no reason left for radio silence. Harrison's jaw was tight. Raise her. Callahan keyed the handset. Echo 7, this is base. Echo 7, the package is secure. I say again, all 14 are across and consolidated. The operation is complete. Come in, Captain. Great shooting. Come home. Static. Echo 7 base, do you copy? Static. The tent, which had begun to breathe again, stopped once more. Harrison felt the old cold feeling crawl back up his spine, the feeling he'd had when she first walked in, and he couldn't find her fear, except now it was pointed the other way. Now it was fear for her instead of doubt about her, and he found he didn't like it any better. Echo 7, Callahan said, and his voice had lost all its relief. Captain Carter, please respond. Static. She might just be holding silence out of habit, Brooks said, but he didn't sound like he believed it. She might be coming down off the tower. That climb was... There's no way to do that climb and work a radio at the same time. She'd answers, Harrison said. A woman that precise, that disciplined, she heard Callahan's first transmission. If she could answer, she'd answer, if only to tell us to stop cluttering the net. He was already moving toward the map. Callahan, get me the thermal on that tower. Right now. I want eyes on the western slope. Callahan pulled it up with hands that had gone cold. The thermal took a moment to resolve 4 kilometers of dark valley rendering into heat, and the tent crowded around the monitor, and there was the ridge, and there was the draw where the Marines had run, and there on the western edge was the broken tooth of the tower. And on top of the tower there was a single heat signature, and it was not moving. There, Callahan said, that's her, that's got to be her. But his voice climbed at the end of it, made it a question instead of a statement, because a person who had just done what she'd done, a person who was fine, would be moving, would be breaking down the rifle, would be starting the long climb down. And the signature on the tower was doing none of those things. It was lying flat behind where the .50 caliber would be, exactly where a shooter lies, and it was not moving at all. Zoom it, Harrison said. Callahan, zoom that in. Callahan zoomed it in. And the tent went absolutely, completely silent. The kind of silence that has a weight to it, because the closer view showed them the shooting position on the tower, and it showed them the shape of a person lying in it, and it showed them at the very edge of the tower's cracked platform. A second thing they had not seen before, a smear of heat that was cooling, spreading in a shape that no man in that tent could look at and pretend not to recognize. That's blood. Boyd would have said it if Boyd had been there, but Boyd was 4 kilometers north, being pulled behind cover by men who loved him. In the tent, it was Callahan who said it in a whisper because somebody had to. That's blood, he said. Sir, there's blood on the tower. Harrison stared at the thermal. 5 shots, he was thinking. 5 shots and then nothing. She'd cleared the observer, then held the door with 4 more, one enemy at a time, the last of them, that hard left flank shot that had saved Ruiz's whole column. 5 perfect shots. And then silence. And then no movement. And now blood cooling on the platform of a tower everyone had sworn nobody would ever use, where a woman had gone alone, off the net, carrying nothing but a rifle, and a certainty to hold a kill zone by herself so that 14 strangers could go home. Somewhere in the middle of the 5th shot, or just after it, something had happened up there. One of the enemy fighters she was hunting, or one she hadn't seen in the confusion in the last seconds before the door slammed shut, had found her on her tower after all. The one place the observer had sworn was safe. The one door nobody was supposed to use. Somebody down in that valley, in the dying chaos of a battle she had single-handedly turned, had put eyes on the western slope at the worst possible moment and put a round into the woman who'd spent her whole night making sure the enemy stayed 1 step behind. And she had kept shooting anyway. That was the thing Harrison couldn't stop seeing. 5 shots. If she'd been hit during the 4th or the 5th, if that blood on the platform had started spreading before her work was done, then she had finished it hit. She had cleared the left angle that would have massacred Ruiz's column while she was bleeding out on a tower because stopping meant 14 men died, and she had already told them in the command tent in that flat, unshakable voice that the beginning of a battle didn't matter, only how it ended. "Get me a bird to that tower," Harrison said, and his voice was not the voice that had mocked her hours ago. It was low and it was shaking, and it was absolutely without hesitation. "Right now, I don't care what it takes or what it costs or who I have to wake up. That valley is turning our way, and I want a medevac on that western slope inside of 10 minutes. Callahan, keep trying to raise her. Every 15 seconds. Do not stop." She held the door for those men. "We are going to hold it for her." Callahan keyed the handset, and his voice was breaking, and he did not care who heard it break. "Echo 7 base, Captain Carter. If you can hear me, help is coming. Do you understand? You held the line. All 14 are home. Now you hold on, Captain. You hold on the way you made them hold on. Help is coming. Echo 7, please. Please come in." And on the tower, 4 kilometers north, high above a valley that had belonged to the enemy an hour before and belonged to no one now, the single heat signature lay behind the 50 caliber and did not move and did not answer, and the blood spread slow and dark across the cracked concrete of a position everyone had written off as a grave. The medevac bird was in the air in 6 minutes, which was a kind of miracle in itself, and Blake Harrison spent every one of those 6 minutes standing over the thermal feed, watching a heat signature that would not move, willing it to move, and it did not. "Still nothing on the net?" he asked, and he'd asked it 4 times already, and he knew the answer, and he asked it anyway, because asking was the only thing left that felt like doing something. "Still nothing, sir." Callahan hadn't stopped keying the handset the whole time, every 15 seconds, like Harrison had ordered, and his voice had gone hoarse from it. "Echo 7 base, Captain Carter. The bird is inbound. You'll hear it any minute now. Just hold on, please. Just hold on." Static. Brooks stood a little apart from the two of them, arms folded, and he was doing the thing colonels have to do, which is stay upright and clear-eyed when everyone around them is coming in undone. But the cost of it showed in his face. He had put a stranger on that tower. He had made the call. He had listened to Harrison's objections and to his own gut and to a woman who spoke in certainties, and he had sent her up a ruin everyone said was a grave, and now she was lying on it, not moving, and the arithmetic of command meant that whatever had happened to her up there was in the final accounting his. "Colonel," McCallahan said, and there was something desperate in it, "when the bird gets eyes on her, if she's—" He couldn't finish it. "Then we deal with what is," Brooks said, "not with what we're afraid of. Keep transmitting, son." 4 kilometers north on top of the tower, Evelyn Carter was not dead. She was, however, in the middle of the longest and most private battle of the night. And it was a battle no one in the command tent could see, and no thermal feed could show them because it was happening entirely inside her. The round had caught her during the 4th shot. She'd known it the way you know these things, a heavy blunt punch, high on the left side under the shoulder that had spun the world sideways for a half second, and then come roaring back as a specific and enormous pain. She had understood in the cold clinical part of her mind that never fully switched off exactly what had happened. One of the enemy fighters below, in the dying confusion of the broken machine, had finally done the thing the observer swore no one would do. He'd looked up at the western slope. He'd found the muzzle flash of a 50 caliber on a tower that wasn't supposed to matter. And he'd put a round into her before she'd even known he was there. And in the half second after the punch, with the world spun sideways in the pain arriving like a train, Evelyn Carter had made a decision, and it was the same decision she had made her whole life in every place she was not allowed to name. And it was the decision that separated her from almost every other human being who had ever held a rifle. She had not stopped. There had been an enemy fighter working toward the left flank of the draw. She'd already identified him as the dangerous one, the one who could rake Ruiz's whole column, and when the round hit her, she had a choice, which was to attend to the fact that she was now bleeding badly on a tower with no way down, or to finish the shot. And she'd finished the shot. She had dragged the spun world back level with a strength that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the thing underneath her body, and she'd put the crosshairs back on that fighter on the left flank, and she'd made the hardest shot of the night with a bullet already inside her, and she'd cleared the angle that would have killed 14 men, and only then Only after the fifth crack rolled down the valley and the left flank went quiet and Ruiz's column got up and ran the last of the draw to safety. Only then had Evelyn Carter allowed herself to lie down behind her rifle and start dealing with the fact that she was in a real and mathematical sense running out of time. That had been 4 minutes ago. It felt like 4 hours. She'd gotten a hand up under her armor and found the wound and understood from the warmth of it and the pace of it that this was serious but not immediately fatal, which was both the best and the worst news because it meant she could survive this if help came fast, and it meant she would have plenty of conscious time to appreciate not surviving it if help came slow. She'd packed the wound as best she could with the field dressing from the pouch on her belt, working left-handed and blind, and she'd done it the way she did everything methodically, without panic, narrating the steps to herself in her own head to keep the panic where it belonged, which was outside. The radio was 3 feet away, and it might as well have been 3 miles. She'd heard Callahan calling her. She'd heard every transmission, the packages secure, all 14 are across, great shooting, come home, and then the tone shifting, the please, the hold on, and she'd understood that they'd seen the blood on the thermal and put it together. She wanted to answer them. She wanted in a way that surprised her with its intensity to key that handset and tell Callahan she was alive to take that particular weight off the young man's voice, because there had been something in it, some raw and undefended care that had reached her even up here, even now. But the radio was 3 feet away, and 3 feet right now was a distance she could not reliably cross, because crossing it meant rolling onto the wounded side or reaching across her own body with her one good arm and destabilizing the pressure she was holding on the packed wound. And either of those things might open her back up, and she had done the arithmetic on that too. And the arithmetic said that if she reopened the wound reaching for a radio, she would likely finish bleeding out before she finished the sentence. And a woman who bled out mid-transmission was worse than a silent one, because a silent one left them hope, and a woman who died on the net took their hope with her. So she made another decision, the same kind she'd been making all night, the kind that put other people's minds ahead of her own comfort. She would not reach for the radio. She would hold pressure on the wound, and she would keep breathing, and she would stay conscious, and she would let the silence do to them what it had to do. Because a silence that ended with a live captain lifted off a tower was survivable for everyone, and a broadcast death was not. The pain came in waves, and between the waves she talked to herself, and what she said to herself was strange, and she knew it was strange, and she said it anyway. The beginning of a battle doesn't matter, she said out loud to no one, her voice a thread. What matters is how it ends. She'd said it to Harrison hours ago in the resolution of another fight in a future that hadn't happened yet, except now she understood it was always going to be this fight. She'd meant this ending, this tower. You made them hold Carter. Now you hold. Same rules for you as for them. 6 minutes and 40 seconds after the 5th shot, she heard the bird. It came in low and fast from the south, and the sound of it did something to Evelyn that all her discipline could not entirely control, because the sound of an inbound friendly helicopter is the most beautiful sound in the world to a person bleeding on a tower. And for one moment, the wall she'd built between herself and the panic developed a crack, and a single tear ran sideways across the bridge of her nose and fell onto the concrete. And she let it because there was no one there to see it, and even she was a loud one. In the command tent, the pilot's voice came over the net, and the whole room turned toward the speaker as one. Base, this is Dustoff 2-6. I'm on station over the Western Tower, and I've got a pause. The pause lasted a year. I've got a survivor. I say again, I have movement. The shooter is moving. She's got a hand up. She's waving me off. The direct approach, she's pointing. Another pause. She's still running the show up here base. She's wounded, and she's waving me toward a cleaner LZ on the north face. She won't even let me land wrong. The tent broke. It broke the way the support element had broken when the Marines crossed to safety, not with a cheer, but with something rougher and more human. And Callahan put his face down on the radio bench, and his shoulders shook, and Brooks pressed the heel of his hand hard against his own mouth and turned away for a moment. And Harrison, 18 years and 3 deployments, and a reputation built on never letting anyone see him crack, put one hand flat on the map table to steady himself, and let out a breath that, had he realized, been held since the 5th shot. She's alive, Callahan said into the bench, his voice muffled and wrecked. She's alive. She's alive. She's alive, Harrison confirmed, and his own voice wasn't much steadier. And she's still working. Of course she is. Of course she is. He straightened and he made himself become the operations officer again because there was a wounded captain on a tower and sentiment didn't lift her off it, procedure did. Dust off 2-6 base, you follow her guidance, you hear me? That woman has been right about every single thing tonight. If she's waving you toward the north face, then the north face is where you land. Get her aboard, get her stable, and get her to the surgical team, and you fly like her life depends on it, because it does. Copy that, base. Coming around to the north face now, and base, the pilot's voice had something in it, some professional awe held carefully in check. Whoever this is up here, whatever she did tonight, you make sure the right people hear about it. I've pulled a lot of folks off a lot of bad places. I never pulled one who waved me off her own rescue so I wouldn't land in a hot spot. Never once. We'll make sure, Harrison said quietly. Believe me, we'll make sure. The extraction took 4 minutes. They were 4 terrible minutes because the enemy in the valley, though, broken though scattered, was not gone, and a helicopter on a tower is a target, and everyone in the command tent understood that the last cruelty of a night like this would be to lose her in the extraction, after everything to have her survive the wound and the wait only to die in the last 100 feet. So the tent held its breath again, and Harrison worked the support element and every asset he had to keep the enemy's heads down around the western slope, and Callahan tracked the bird on the thermal, and Brooks stood very still and did the thing he'd done all night, which was hold the room up by refusing to let it see him break. And then the pilot's voice came again, and it was lighter unclenched, the voice of a man who has gotten his people off the ground. Base dust off 2-6. We are wheels up with the patient aboard, I say again. Wheels up, we are clear of the tower and clear of heroine of the valley inbound to the surgical team. ETA, 9 minutes. Patient is conscious. Patient is stable. Patient is a short laugh, disbelieving warm. Patient is asking whether all 14 made it. First thing she said when we got her aboard, not about herself, about the 14. Callahan lifted his head off the bench. His face was a wreck, and he didn't care. Tell her, he said. Dust off, tell her yes. Tell her all 14, both wounded alive. Tell her she did it. Tell her exactly that. Tell her she did it. There was a pause while the pilot relayed it, and then the pilot came back on, and his voice had gone quiet. I told her base. A beat. She closed her eyes, didn't say anything, just closed her eyes like he stopped searching for it. Like a person who's been carrying something heavy and just got to set it down. That's all. Just closed her eyes and set it down. And in the command tent, 4 kilometers south, 3 grown men who had spent the night in the business of war stood around a radio and were undone by the image of a wounded woman on a helicopter, closing her eyes because 14 strangers she had never met were going home. 9 minutes later, Dust Off 2-6 sat down at the surgical team's pad, and Evelyn Carter went into the hands of people whose whole reason for existing was to make sure that soldiers who had given everything didn't give the last thing too. And for the next several hours, the command tent had no news, because the surgical team's job was to work and not to narrate, and Harrison had learned the hard way not to bother them with questions. So instead, he did the other work, the work that filled the terrible waiting. He debriefed the extraction. He coordinated the consolidation of Ruiz's unit and the wounded into the larger position. He worked the enemy situation, which had gone from a coordinated assault to a scattered rout, the broken machine that had never recovered its mind, and he watched the last of the enemy fighters melt back into the mountains they'd come from, and he understood watching it exactly what one shot from one tower had done. He wrote none of it down yet because there would be time for reports, and reports were for later. And right now, the only thing that mattered was that 14 Marines were alive who should have been dead, and the person responsible was on a table somewhere fighting a battle of her own. Around 3 in the morning, Callahan found him outside the tent. Harrison was standing in the dark, looking north toward the mountains, toward the tower he could not see, and Callahan came up beside him and didn't say anything for a while. And the two of them just stood there, the old operations officer and the young radio man, connected now by a night that had rearranged both of them. You vouched for her, Callahan finally said. On the net, to Ruiz, before the shot. He turned to look at Harrison. Why you'd been telling everybody in that tent she was a joke, right up until she found the pattern on the map. And even after that, you were fighting her on the tower. And then you got on the net and told 14 dying men to trust her, like she'd already earned it. Why the change? What did you see? Harrison was quiet for a long moment. I didn't see anything, he said finally. That's the truth. I didn't have some flash of insight where I suddenly understood who she was. I want to tell you I did because it'd make me sound wiser than I am. But the honest answer is, I looked at that map and I looked at what she'd pulled out of 6 hours of tape that I'd stared at and missed, and I ran into a wall, Callahan. I ran into the edge of my own certainty. 18 years I've been able to look at a situation and know things. Know who'll break and who'll hold, know which plan lives and which one dies. And she walked into my tent and did something I could not do, could not even understand how she did. And I had two choices. I could keep insisting I was the smartest man in the room and probably get 14 men killed, proving it. Or I could admit that the thing I was looking at was bigger than my certainty and get out of its way. He turned to face the young man. You want to know the hardest thing a man learns in this business? It's not courage. Courage is easy comparatively. Any fool can be brave. The hardest thing is knowing the difference between the situations where your judgment is the most valuable thing in the room and the situations where your judgment is the thing that's going to get people killed, and knowing it fast enough to act on it. He looked back toward the mountains. She gave me about 90 seconds to figure out which kind of situation I was in, and I damn near failed. I almost sent her back. You heard me. I threw a radio slip on the table and demanded they send a real warrior. He shook his head slowly. A real warrior. God forgive me. She was standing 4 feet away. Callahan didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to that, and because he understood that Harrison wasn't really talking to him. He was talking to something in himself, doing the accounting a man does after a night like this, the accounting that separates the ones who learn from the ones who just get older. She's going to make it, Callahan said. It wasn't a question. He decided to believe it, and believe he'd learned tonight could change a room, could change a battle, could maybe change this too. I think she is, Harrison said. The pilot said stable. Stable's a good word. Stable means the machine's not broken, just damaged, and damaged we can fix. He almost smiled. She'd appreciate that, probably. Thinking about her body the way she thought about that enemy formation. A machine you can fix if you understand it. They stood there a while longer, and then a runner came out of the tent looking for Harrison, and the night's work pulled him back in, and Callahan stayed outside a moment longer looking north before he followed. The news came at dawn. It came the way good news comes in a war. Undramatically, a med officer walking into the command tent with a clipboard and a tired face and a sentence that landed like a sunrise. Captain Carter's out of surgery, the med officer said. The round missed the artery by about a centimeter and missed the lung by about the same. She lost a lot of blood, and she's going to be laid up a good while, and she is not going to be lifting anything with that left arm for months. But she's going to keep the arm, and she's going to keep her life, and barring something we don't expect, she's going to make a full recovery. He glanced at his clipboard. She's awake if anybody wants to know. Groggy but awake, and she's already asked twice to see the sergeant from the unit she pulled out. Ruiz. Harrison and Brooks looked at each other, and something passed between them, the same thing that had passed between them hours ago when Brooks had made the call to send her up the tower, except now it had a different color to it, relief instead of dread, Get Ruiz over there, Brooks said. Eyes or shadow. The moment he's able. That man's been asking about her since the second he got behind cover. Let them see each other. They earned that. Diego Ruiz went to see Evelyn Carter that afternoon, and what passed between them Ruiz would never fully be able to explain to anyone, though. He'd try over the years to men who asked him about the night on the ridge. He walked into the recovery area, still moving like a man who'd run for his life, carrying another man still hollowed out and raw, and he found her propped up in a bed with her left arm strapped and her face pale and her eyes. When they found him exactly as clear and steady as they'd been on the tape she'd listened to in the command tent. Though of course he didn't know about that part, he only knew the voice on the radio and the shot that had saved them all. He stood at the foot of her bed and he didn't know what to say. This sergeant who always knew what to say, and Evelyn watched him struggle with it, and she took the weight off him, the way she'd taken the weight off Callahan by not dying on the net, the way she took weight off people as a reflex, as a way of being in the world. You held them together, she said. Her voice was thin, but it was hers. 6 hours under fire, 2 men down in a hole somebody was squeezing shut on you. and you kept 14 people alive long enough for me to do my part. You know that's the hard job, right? Mine was one afternoon. Yours was 6 hours. I just did the last piece. Ruiz's throat worked. Captain, with respect, that is the biggest pile of nonsense I have ever heard, and I have heard some world-class nonsense in this corps. His voice cracked and he let it. You climbed a tower everybody said was a grave. You did it with a bullet, ma'am. The pilot told us. You did the shot that saved Boyd and Ramirez and every man behind them after you were already hit. You waved off your own rescue bird so it wouldn't land somewhere hot. So you can talk all you want about your one afternoon, but I've got 14 people, 14, including 2 who'd be dead right now, and every single one of them is alive because of what you did on that tower. So don't do the thing where you make it small. Not to us, not to me. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something she didn't often let show. 14, she said softly, all 14. Both wounded. Both wounded, Hollis and Delgado. Hollis is going to walk again, they think. Delgado's already complaining, which the docs say is a good sign. Ruiz's mouth twitched toward a smile and then went serious again. They both know your name now. Everybody does. The whole unit. There's 14 men, Captain, who are going to say your name to their kids someday. That's not small. That's the opposite of small. And Evelyn Carter, who had spent a career being classified hidden unrecognized, who had made a peace long ago with the fact that the people she saved would mostly never know her name, looked at this sergeant who had just told her that 14 men would carry her name to their children, and for the second time in 12 hours, a single tear ran sideways across her face, and this time there was someone there to see it, and she let him see it because Diego Ruiz had earned that too. That's a good ending, she said, finally, her voice rough. Ruiz didn't understand what she meant, not exactly, but he understood enough. Ma'am, the beginning of a battle doesn't matter, Evelyn said, and there was the ghost of something almost like peace in it. I've said that a lot of times to a lot of people, usually people who were doubting themselves at the start of something hard. It's always been about them. First time I ever got to say it about my own. She looked at the ceiling. This one started with a major throwing a radio slip on a table and demanding they send a real warrior instead of me. I heard about that, by the way. Word travels. A faint smile. And it ended with 14 men who'll say my name to their kids. So, she closed her eyes the way the pilot had described, like setting down something heavy. The beginning didn't matter, just the ending. 14, that's the ending. I'll take it. When Ruiz came out of the recovery area, Harrison was waiting. He'd been waiting for an hour, though he'd have denied it if anyone asked, would have claimed he happened to be passing through. And Ruiz, who was a sergeant and therefore fluent in the small dishonesties officers told to protect their dignity, let him have it. How is she? Harrison asked. She's Carter, Ruiz said, which was already after one afternoon a complete answer, and Harrison understood it as one. She'll be fine, better than fine. And Major Ruiz hesitated, then decided the man could take it. She knows about the radio slip, the send a real warrior thing. She knows, Harrison closed his eyes for a second. Of course she does. She wasn't angry about it, if that helps. She smiled about it, actually. Said the beginning of a battle that doesn't matter, only the ending. Ruiz studied the older man's face. But if you're planning to say something to her, sir, if you're carrying some speech around about how wrong you were, I'd think about whether she needs to hear it or whether you need to say it. Because from where I was standing in that room, ma'am has already forgiven you for something she never even took personally. So the apology might be more for you than for her. It was an extraordinary thing for a sergeant to say to a major, and both of them knew it, and in any other circumstance it might have been a problem. But this was not any other circumstance. This was the morning after a night that had rearranged the rules, and Harrison, who had spent that night learning the difference between the situations where his judgment mattered and the situations where it would get people killed, recognized wisdom when it was handed to him even by a sergeant, even about himself. You're probably right, Harrison said, but I'm going to say it anyway. Not because she needs it, because I do. There's things a man has to say out loud, Sergeant, or they sit in him and rot. I called a woman a joke in front of 40 men, and then she nearly died, saving 14 of ours. And if I don't stand in front of her and own that with my own mouth, I'll carry it wrong for the rest of my life. She may not need the apology, but I need to have given it. There's a difference, and at my age, I've finally learned to tell them apart. Ruiz looked at him for a long moment and then he nodded one professional to another, one man who'd been changed by the night to another. Then she's awake, sir, he said. And I think whatever she says about not needing it, I think she'd rather hear it than not. People like her, the ones who take the weight off everybody else all the time, the ones who wave off their own rescue so nobody lands somewhere hot. He shook his head. Nobody ever takes the weight off them. Nobody ever tells them it mattered. So go tell her it mattered, Major. Not that you're sorry, that it mattered. That's the thing she probably never gets to hear. And Blake Harrison, who had walked into the previous evening as the most certain man in the room and would walk out of the next hour as something humbler and larger, stood outside the recovery area, gathering himself to go say to a wounded captain the truest thing he had ever needed to say to anyone. While inside, Evelyn Carter lay with her eyes closed and her arms strapped and 14 men's futures resting quiet in her chest, like a debt finally fully paid. And the word she kept turning over, the word that was better than any medal they could pin on her. The word that was the whole ending she'd been waiting her entire hidden career to earn, was the simplest one there was. 14, Harrison stood outside the recovery area for a full 2 minutes before he went in, and Ruiz, watching from down the corridor, understood exactly what those 2 minutes were because he'd spent them himself outside more doors than he could count. They were the 2 minutes a man spends deciding whether he's going in there to say the thing or to say a smaller, safer version of the thing that will let him keep some of his pride. And Ruiz watched Blake Harrison make the choice, watched it in the set of his shoulders, and then Harrison pushed the door open and went in, and Ruiz turned and walked away because some conversations aren't meant to have witnesses. Evelyn heard the door and opened her eyes. She knew who it was before she saw him. She'd known he would come. She'd known it the way she knew most things, by reading the pattern. And the pattern of Blake Harrison was the patterns of a proud man who had been forced to look at himself, and men like that either ran from the mirror or walked straight into it. And everything she'd seen of him in the command tent told her he was a mirror walker. So she wasn't surprised to see him standing at the foot of her bed with his hat in his hands, an old-fashioned gesture that told her more about his state of mind than anything he could have said. "Major," she said. "Captain." He turned the hat once in his hands. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone put a bullet in me and a surgeon spent 4 hours arguing with it?" A faint smile. "Which is exactly what happened, so accurate. I'm going to be fine. You didn't come here to ask about my recovery, though." "No," Harrison admitted. "I didn't." "Then say what you came to say. You'll feel better once it's out, and I've got nowhere to be." She shifted slightly against the pillows, and it cost her, and she didn't let it show much. "Go ahead, Major. I've been doing this long enough to know what a man looks like when he's carrying something he needs to set down. I watched you carry it all the way across this room. Set it down." Harrison looked at her, and something in him gave way. The way a dam gives way, not all at once, but at a single point that then becomes the whole thing. "I called you a joke," he said, "in front of 40 men before I ever laid eyes on you. Headquarters said Echo 7 was inbound, and I looked at the name I didn't recognize, and I threw a radio slip on the table and I said, he made himself say it, made himself use the exact words, because a real apology doesn't soften the crime. I said they're sending us a real warrior because apparently we've reached the point where they're sending a quiet girl with a rifle case to save an entire platoon. That's what I said. And then you walked in about a minute later and I doubled down. I stood there and demanded you explain what made you the person they sent, like you owed me a resume while men were dying. And then you found in 6 hours of tape what I'd stared at all afternoon and missed. And I still fought you on the tower, called it a death sentence, tried to talk you out of the one plan that ended up saving everybody." "All true," Evelyn said mildly. "What's your point?" "My point is that I was wrong in about 6 different ways in the space of an hour, and every single one of those ways could have gotten 14 men killed, and the only reason it didn't is that you were better than my worst instincts. So I came here to own it, out loud, to your face. I was wrong about you, Captain Carter, not a little wrong, completely wrong, and I'm sorry." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, studying him. "That's a good apology," she said finally. "Cleaner than most. You didn't make excuses, you didn't explain it away. You didn't do the thing where a man apologizes in a way that's secretly asking the other person to comfort him for having been wrong. You just owned it. I respect that." She paused. "But Ruiz told you something before you came in here, didn't he? He told you the apology was more for you than for me." Harrison blinked. How did you? Because it's what I'd have told you, and Ruiz strikes me as a man who sees clearly. And he was right. You needed to say that more than I needed to hear it, which is fine, that's allowed. But I wanted to give you something back, Major, and I want you to actually hear it, because I think you've been so busy being ashamed of the beginning that you've missed the part that matters. She held his eyes. Do you know why you were able to say what you just said? Why you were able to walk into this room with your hat in your hands and own being wrong in front of a woman half your rank? Because I owed it to you. No, lots of men owe apologies they never pay. You paid it because when the moment came when you were standing in that command tent with your certainty in one hand and 14 lives in the other, you did the hardest thing a person can do. You let go of the certainty. You had 90 seconds to figure out that the situation was bigger than your judgment, and you figured it out, and you got out of the way, and you got on the net and vouched for me to race when a lesser man would have hedged. She let that land. The apology isn't the impressive thing you did tonight, Major. The apology is easy comparatively. The impressive thing is that in the actual moment when it counted, when being wrong would have killed people, you chose the men over your pride. You've been carrying the beginning around like it defines you. It doesn't. What you did in the middle is what defines you. And what you did in the middle was get out of the way of the thing that could save your men, even though it meant admitting you weren't the smartest person in the room. Most men can't do that. You did. So stop flogging yourself over the radio slip. It's the least interesting thing about your night. Harrison stood there and absorbed it, and something shifted in his face, some weight he'd been carrying since the fifth shot loosening its grip, and Evelyn watched it happen and was glad because taking the weight off people was in the end the only thing she'd ever really wanted to do on towers and off them. You know, Harrison said slowly, I came in here to make you feel better, and somehow you turned it around and made me feel better instead. How do you do that? Practice, Evelyn said. And it's not a trick if that's what you're thinking. I'm not managing you. I just genuinely think you're being too hard on yourself. And I've found that most people are most of the time, and that a little accuracy about their own worth does them more good than almost anything else you can offer them. She shifted again, wincing. That's the whole secret, Major, if you want it. People are starving to be seen accurately. Not flattered, seen. You tell a man the true good thing about himself that nobody else bothered to notice, and you'll have done more for him than a medal. Harrison sat down uninvited in the chair by her bed and set his hat on his knee. Can I ask you something, he said, off the record, not major to captain, just one soldier to another. You can ask, I might not answer. A lot of my answers are classified. That's actually what I want to ask about. He turned the hat on his knee. Echo 7, the call sign, the way headquarters said it, like everybody upstairs knew exactly who they were sending and exactly what she could do, and only the rest of us were in the dark. The way you read that tape, the way you made a shot with a bullet in you, the way you waved off your own rescue bird so it wouldn't land somewhere hot. That's not a normal skill set, Captain. That's not even an elite skill set. That's something else. So I guess my question is, he hesitated. Who are you really? Because I've been in this Corps 18 years and I've never met anybody like you, and I've got a feeling that's not an accident. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, some calculation about what she could say and what she couldn't, and Harrison watched her do it and understood that he was watching a person decide how much of a hidden life to open up. Most of what I've done I can't talk about, she said finally. That's not me being mysterious, it's the actual rule. And it's a rule I've kept for a long time, and I'm going to keep it now. So I can't tell you the missions or the places or the names. But I can tell you the shape of it because I think you've earned the shape and because I think it might be useful to you. She looked at the ceiling. I've spent my whole career being the person they send when the normal answers have run out. The units nobody's heard of. The problems that don't have a doctrine written for them. And the thing about that work, the thing nobody tells you when you start, is that it makes you invisible. Not metaphorically, actually invisible. Everything I've done that mattered is classified, which means officially it didn't happen. Which means the people I saved mostly never knew my name, and the ones who did weren't allowed to say it. I've pulled people out of places I can't describe and watched them go home to families who will never know I existed. That's the job. That's the trade you make. That sounds lonely, Harrison said quietly. It is. Evelyn agreed, and there was no self-pity in it, just accuracy, the same accuracy she offered everyone else. It's the loneliest work there is. You give everything, and the giving is invisible, and you make your peace with that, or you don't survive it. I made my peace with it a long time ago. I told myself that people mattered more than the recognition, and I believed it, and it was true, and it got me through. She turned her head to look at him. But I'll tell you something, I've never told anybody, Major, and I'm only telling you because I nearly died last night, and it's made me honest. There's a cost to being invisible that nobody warns you about. It's not that you want the medals. I don't care about medals. It's that after enough years of it, you start to wonder whether you're real. Whether the good you did actually happened if nobody knows it happened. Whether you exist at all outside of your own head. Harrison didn't say anything. He understood that he was being trusted with something, and that the right response to being trusted was to stay quiet and let it be said. And then last night it happened, Evelyn continued, and this morning a sergeant named Ruiz stood at the foot of this bed and told me that 14 men are going to say my name to their kids someday. And I've saved a lot of people, Major. More than 14. A lot more. But that's the first time anyone ever stood in front of me and told me my name would outlive the mission. And her voice caught just slightly, and she let it the way she'd let the tear fall on the tower. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until I heard it. 14 people who know I'm real, after a whole career of being a ghost that saves people and disappears. 14 who will remember. She stopped. That's the thing they can't classify. They can hide the missions and redact the reports and pretend I don't exist, but they can't reach into 14 men's memories and take my name back out. That's mine now. That's permanent. And it's the first permanent thing I've had in a very long time. Harrison sat with that, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. It's not 14, he said. Evelyn looked at him. It's not 14 who'll remember your name, Harrison said. It's everyone in that command tent. It's Brooks who made the call to send you and spent the whole night knowing that if it went wrong, it was on him, and it didn't go wrong because of you. It's Callahan, that young radio operator, who kept your channel open and cried like a baby when the pilot said you were alive, and who is going to tell the story of Echo 7 for the rest of his career, whether the Corps lets him or not. It's the medevac pilot who told me he's pulled a lot of people off, a lot of bad places, and never once pulled one who waved him off her own rescue so he wouldn't land in a hot spot. And who is going to tell that story too? It's Ruiz and Boyd and Ramirez and Hollis and Delgado and every man in that unit. And it's me. He met her eyes. It's me, Captain. 18 years I've been in this Corps, and I've watched a lot of soldiers do a lot of brave things. And I have never seen anything like what you did last night, and I am going to remember it until the day I die. So it's not 14. Do the count again. It's a whole lot more than 14. You just couldn't see all of them from where you were lying on that tower. And Evelyn Carter, who had spent a career making peace with invisibility, who had told herself that people mattered more than the recognition and been right about it and lonely about it, in equal measure looked at the proud, humbled man sitting by her bed with his hat on his knee and found that she had no words, which almost never happened to her. And the two of them sat there in a silence that had more in it than most conversations. And it was enough. The days after moved fast, the way days move when a crisis is broken and the machinery of a large organization turns to the work of processing what happened. Evelyn healed slowly at first, and then faster the way strong bodies do once they've decided to live. The unit she'd saved consolidated and stabilized, and eventually rotated back all 14. Both wounded recovering, and before they went, they did a thing that soldiers do, which was find their way 1 and 2 at a time to the recovery area to see the captain who'd pulled them off the ridge. They came shy, most of them not knowing what to say to the person who was the reason they'd be going home. And Evelyn received each of them with the same accuracy she gave everyone, finding the true good thing about each one and handing it to them so that they left feeling not smaller in the presence of what she'd done, but somehow larger, seen real. Boyd came and couldn't get a full sentence out, and she told him she'd watched him hold the mouth of that drawer open under fire when a lesser man would have run, and that Ramirez was alive because of it, and that holding a door open for other people to escape through was the truest kind of courage there was, and Boyd walked out standing 3 inches taller. Hollis came in a wheelchair, still pale, and told her he'd made it because his sergeant promised to drag him off the ridge personally, And Evelyn told him that a man who gives his sergeant a reason to keep that kind of promise is doing his own kind of holding on. And that surviving when it would have been easier to let go was its own act of courage. And Hollis, who'd been quietly ashamed of how badly he'd been hurt, left the room having reframed his own suffering as strength. One by one, she took the weight off all of them. It was, Ruiz observed to Harrison, the strangest thing he'd ever seen: a wounded woman in a hospital bed making 14 exhausted Marines feel like heroes, when by any accounting she was the only hero in the building. "She can't help it," Harrison said. "I asked her about it. She says people are starving to be seen accurately, and that a little truth about their own worth does more good than anything else you can give them. And she just does it. To everyone. It's like breathing for her." He shook his head. "I've been thinking about it a lot, Ruiz. About what it means that the most dangerous person I've ever met is also the most generous. I don't think those two things are separate. I think they're the same thing, pointed different directions. She reads people accurately. She read that enemy commander accurately enough to break him with one shot, and she reads a scared 19-year-old accurately enough to hand him back his dignity. Same skill, same gift, just aimed different. The truth about Echo 7 spread the way these things spread in an organization built on stories quietly and then not quietly through the channels that official secrecy could never fully close. People who weren't cleared to know the details knew the shape of it anyway, the way Harrison had known the shape before Evelyn confirmed it. A captain nobody recognized sent from the dark who read 6 hours of radio tape and found the pattern. Everyone else had missed who climbed a tower. Everyone called a grave who took a bullet and finished the shot anyway, who waved off her own rescue, who saved 14 and never once made it about herself. Colonel Brooks, who had made the call to send her up that tower and carried the weight of it through the longest night of his command, found her before she rotated out to a facility where she'd finish her recovery. And what he said to her, he'd meant to keep short and professional, and it didn't stay short and professional. "I've commanded soldiers for a long time," Brooks said, standing by her bed the way Harrison had, the way Ruiz had, the way they all did, drawn to her like she was a fixed point. "And I've learned to be careful about how I talk about them, because words like hero get thrown around until they don't mean much. So I want to be precise with you, Captain, because I think you're a person who values precision." He paused. "You didn't win last night because you had the biggest weapon. Half the men in that valley had bigger weapons than the mind you brought to it. You didn't win because you were the bravest, though God knows you were brave. You won because you understood the battlefield when nobody else could, and then you had the discipline to act on that understanding, and then you had the will to finish the job with a bullet in you. Understanding, discipline, and will. That's what you are. Those are rarer than courage. Courage is common. What you have is not." Evelyn received it the way she received everything, with a kind of grave attention that made the person speaking feel heard. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. That means a great deal coming from you. You carried the risk of me all night. If I'd been wrong, it would have been on you. I know that. And you sent me anyway on the strength of a read you couldn't verify because you decided to trust the person over the safe choice. That took its own kind of courage. So we understand each other, I think. We both know what it costs to act on a certainty other people can't see." Brooks almost smiled. "You know, Harrison said something similar about you, that the dangerous thing and the generous thing about you are the same thing, pointed different directions." "Harrison's smarter than he lets himself believe," Evelyn said. "Most proud men are. The pride's usually covering up a mind that sees too much and doesn't know what to do with it." She looked at Brooks. "Take care of him, Colonel. He learned something last night that a lot of men never learn, which is the difference between the moments when their judgment is the most valuable thing in the room and the moments when it'll get people killed. That's a rare thing to learn, and it's a fragile thing, and men can unlearn it if the people around them let them slide back into certainty. Don't let him slide back. He's better than he knows, and last night proved it, and it would be a shame to lose that." Brooks looked at her for a long moment. "You've known the man for a few days, and you're already managing his development like you're going to be responsible for it." "I take the weight off people," Evelyn said simply. "It's what I do, on towers and off them. Harrison's carrying less now than he was 3 days ago, and I'd like it to stay that way after I'm gone, and you're the one who'll be here, so I'm handing you the thread. That's all." She shifted against the pillows. "Somebody has to keep an eye on the good ones. Might as well be the colonel who was smart enough to trust a stranger with 14 lives." The day she rotated out, they came to see her off, the ones who could. Brooks, formal and grave. Callahan, the young radio operator, who couldn't quite meet her eyes at first, because the last time he'd been near her voice, he'd been crying into a handset, begging her to hold on. And Evelyn made it easy for him. The way she made everything easy, telling him that a man who keeps a channel open and keeps talking to a soldier he thinks might be dying, who refuses to give up on the silence, is doing the most important job on any battlefield, which is refusing to let anyone face the dark alone. Callahan left that conversation changed the way they all did. And Harrison came last. He didn't have his hat in his hands this time. He'd said the thing he needed to say, and he'd heard the thing he needed to hear, and what was left between them was simpler and cleaner than an apology. So this is it, he said. Echo 7 disappears back into the classified dark, and the rest of us are left telling a story nobody's allowed to fully believe. That's the job, Evelyn said. You know that now. I know it now. He looked at her. For what it's worth, Captain, I've decided I'm going to be a problem about it. The believing part. I know the missions are classified and the reports are redacted, and officially you're a ghost. But I'm going to spend the rest of my career telling young officers about the night a captain nobody recognized walked into my tent and made me eat every certain word I'd ever said. I can't tell them the details. But I can tell them the lesson. Never look at a soldier and think you know what they can do based on how they look walking through the flap. I learned that the hard way, and I'm going to make sure it costs them less than it almost cost me. Evelyn smiled, and it was a real one. Unguarded, the smile of a woman who has spent a career invisible and is for once being seen and remembered on purpose. That's a good use of it, she said. Better than a medal. A lesson that keeps getting taught outlives the person who taught it. You do that, Major, and you'll have made me more permanent than any commendation ever could. She held out her good hand. Take care of yourself, and take care of them. That's the whole job in the end. Everything else is just details. Harrison took her hand, and this time there was no war behind his eyes, no doubt. No reconstruction of a proud man's certainty, just the clean respect of one soldier for another. It was an honor, Captain Carter, he said. The genuine kind. The kind I'll be measuring myself against for the rest of my life. And Evelyn, on Carter Echo 7, she said the ghost who saved people and disappeared went back into the classified dark. She'd come from carrying with her the one thing they hadn't been able to redact. The one permanent thing, the memory of 14 men in a command tent full of soldiers who knew now and forever exactly how real she was and exactly what a warrior actually looked like when one finally walked through the flap carrying nothing but a rifle case and a truth. The story of Echo 7 should have ended there in the classified dark the way all her stories ended. But this one didn't, and the reason it didn't had a name, and the name was Blake Harrison, who had made himself a promise on the day she rotated out and who was above all the things he'd learned to be a man who kept promises. It started small the way these things do. 8 months after the Ridge, Harrison stood in front of a room full of young officers at a training command far from any battlefield. And he was supposed to be teaching them about reconnaissance and situational assessment, and he was doing it badly because the material was dry and the officers were bored, and he could feel the whole room sliding toward the glazed-over indifference that kills learning. And somewhere in the middle of a slide about intelligence integration, Blake Harrison stopped talking and set down his notes and did the thing he'd promised a wounded captain he would do. I want to tell you about a night, he said. I can't tell you where and I can't tell you when, and I can't tell you the name of the person I'm about to describe because all of it is classified and it's going to stay classified. But I can tell you the shape of it and I can tell you the lesson. And if you remember nothing else I say in this entire course, I want you to remember this. The room came awake. There's a thing that happens when a man who's been going through the motions suddenly means what he's saying, and every officer in that room felt it. There was a captain, Harrison said, sent to my position when everything had already gone wrong. 14 of our people trapped ammunition, gone comms, failing 3 rescue attempts turned back. And when headquarters told me help was coming and I saw who they'd sent, I laughed. I stood in front of 40 men and I laughed and I said, they're sending us a real warrior because we've reached the point where they send a quiet person with a rifle case to save an entire platoon. He let that sit. I want you to understand who I was in that moment, he said. I had 18 years in, 3 deployments. I could read a soldier in 10 seconds, or I thought I could. I looked at this captain walking into my command tent, carrying almost nothing, And I decided in about 1 second that I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I was completely catastrophically wrong. Because that captain sat down with 6 hours of radio tape that I had personally stared at all afternoon, and in 11 minutes found the thing that was killing us that I had missed entirely. The enemy wasn't overwhelming us. They were hurting us. There was an observer, one person running the whole operation from a blind angle, and my captain heard it in the voices on the tape, heard it in the pattern of how our men were moving, and reached a conclusion so precise and so correct that it turned a massacre into a rescue. A young lieutenant in the front row had stopped taking notes and was just listening. That captain climbed a tower we'd all written off as a grave. Harrison went on, and his voice had changed, gone quiet and intent. Alone off the radio, took a bullet doing it, and finished the shot anyway, cleared the escape route for our people while bleeding out on the concrete. Waved off the medevac so it wouldn't land somewhere hot. 14 people came home who should have died, and the first thing that captain asked, the very first thing conscious on a helicopter with a bullet just out, was whether all 14 had made it. Not a word about the wound, just the 14. He looked around the room. So here's the lesson, and I want you to write it down because it cost me almost everything to learn it, and I'm giving it to you for free. You will walk into rooms your whole career and see people, and your brain will tell you it knows what they can do based on how they look, how they talk, how they carry themselves, whether they match the picture in your head of what a warrior is supposed to be. And your brain will be confident, and your brain will be fast, and sometimes your brain will be dead wrong. And the cost of being wrong will not be paid by you. It will be paid by the people who don't, because you trusted a first impression over a proven capability. The most dangerous soldier I ever served with walked into my tent looking like the last person you'd send to save a platoon. I almost sent that captain away. If I had 14 people would be dead, and I would have killed them with nothing but my own certainty. The room was silent. Never, Harrison said. Look at a soldier and think you know what they're worth based on what they look like walking through the door. That's the lesson. That's the whole lesson. Now let's get back to intelligence integration, and I want you to think about it differently than you did 5 minutes ago. That was the first time he told it. It was not the last. Word of the way Harrison taught reached Colonel Brooks, who by then had a command of his own, and Brooks did a thing that surprised even him. He'd carried Evelyn's parting request all those months, the thing she'd handed him, about keeping an eye on Harrison, about not letting a good man slide back into the certainty that had almost cost him 14 lives. And when Brooks heard how Harrison was teaching, he understood that the thread she'd handed him had held that Harrison hadn't slid back, that if anything, he'd built his whole late career around the lesson. And Brooks felt something he didn't often feel, which was that a thing had come out right all the way things almost never did in this business. He wrote it up. Not the classified parts, those stayed buried, but the lesson, the shape of it, the way a decorated major had learned humility from a soldier he'd mocked, and turned that humility into a teaching that was now reshaping how young officers thought about judgment. He wrote it up, and he sent it up the chain, and he framed it exactly the way Evelyn had framed it to him in the recovery area, that a lesson which keeps getting taught outlives the person who taught it, and that if the Corps couldn't recognize Echo 7 directly, it could at least recognize what she'd made of Blake Harrison and let that stand as a kind of permanent record that officialdom couldn't redact. 2 years after the Ridge, in a facility whose location she still couldn't disclose, Evelyn Carter received a visitor. She'd healed, of course. The arm had come back, mostly with a stiffness that showed up in cold weather and a scar she never bothered to hide. She was still doing the work, still being the person they sent when the normal answers ran out, still disappearing into the classified dark and coming back out of it, still invisible in the way she'd made her peace with a long time ago. But something had changed since the Ridge, something small and permanent, which was that on the hardest nights when the loneliness of the invisible work pressed down hardest, and she found herself wondering again whether she was real, whether the good she did had actually happened, she had 14 names to reach for. And more than 14, she had a command tent full of them. And that had turned out to be enough, the difference between a person who wonders if they exist and a person who knows for certain that somewhere out there a whole room of people carries proof. The visitor was Diego Ruiz. He was a gunnery sergeant now, older, harder, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there on the ridge, and he stood in the doorway the way he'd stood at the foot of her bed 2 years before, not quite knowing what to say, and Evelyn made it easy for him the way she always had. "Gunny," she said, "they let you in here. That took some doing." Took a lot of doing, ma'am. Called in about 6 favors and lied to 2 people I probably shouldn't have lied to." He came in turning his cover in his hands. "But I had to. I've been carrying something for 2 years, and I finally figured out I wasn't going to be able to set it down until I said it to your face." "Then say it. You know I've got nowhere to be." A faint smile, the old one. "And you know I've never met a weight I couldn't help a man set down." Ruiz's throat worked the way it had 2 years ago. "Hollis walks now," he said. "Full recovery. He's got a limp in the rain, but he walks, and he's out, and he's got a wife and a kid on the way. Name the kid if it's a girl," his voice caught. "He's naming her Eve, told me himself. Said he doesn't know your first name. None of us do, but Echo 7 starts with an E, and Eve was the closest he could get, and he wanted his daughter to carry a piece of the person who's the reason he's alive to have her." Ruiz stopped gathering himself. "Delgado's out too. Boyd's a corporal doing well mouthy as ever. Ramirez re-upped. All 14 of us made it home, ma'am, and all 14 of us are still here, 2 years on living lives we wouldn't have had. And I needed you to know that. Not just that we survived the ridge, that we lived. 2 whole years of living and counting all 14 of us, and every day of it is yours." Evelyn Carter, who had spent a career making peace with never knowing what became of the people she saved, who had trained herself not to wonder because wondering was a door to a grief the work couldn't afford, sat very still and let Diego Ruiz hand her the thing she had never once been given in all her years of hidden service, which was the after. The knowledge of what her sacrifice had grown into. 14 lives still being lived 2 years on. A daughter named for her. And she found that her eyes were wet, and she didn't fight it because Ruiz had crossed a continent and burned 6 favors to bring her this, and the least she could do was let him see that it landed. "A girl named Eve," she said softly. "If it's a girl, Hollis is convinced it is. Says he can feel it." Ruiz smiled through the emotion. "So now there's going to be a whole other person walking around with a piece of you in her name, ma'am. And she's going to grow up, and someday somebody's going to ask her why she's called Eve, and Hollis is going to tell her the story, the parts he's allowed to tell. And that's," he shook his head, "that's forever now. You're in that family forever. They can classify whatever they want. They can't classify a little girl's name." And there it was, the thing Evelyn had said to Harrison in the recovery area 2 years before come back to her, transformed and made larger than she'd ever imagined it. "They can hide the missions and redact the reports and pretend I don't exist," she'd said, "but they can't reach into 14 men's memories and take my name back out." She'd thought that was the ceiling of it, the most permanence a ghost like her could hope for. And now Ruiz was telling her it hadn't stopped at memory. It had grown. It had become a name a child would carry into a future Evelyn would never see, a future that existed at all, only because a captain nobody recognized had climbed a tower everyone called a grave. "Gunny," she said, and her voice was thick, "do you know what you just did? Set down a weight, I hope, ma'am. You did the opposite of what everyone does with me. Every mission I save people and they go home and I never know. The door closes, the report gets redacted. And I've told myself for 20 years that it doesn't matter, that the people matter more than knowing what became of them. And it's true, it is true, but it's also the loneliest true thing in the world. And she pressed the heel of her good hand against her eyes for a moment. You just opened the door back up. You came all this way to tell me the after. Nobody's ever given me the after. In 20 years, nobody's ever come back and told me the people I saved went on to live." Ruiz stood very still. "Then I'm glad I lied to those 2 people, he said quietly. "Ma'am, permission to speak all the way freely. Granted, God knows you've earned it. On the ridge in that hole, when Base told me one person was coming to save us, I didn't believe it. I want you to know that. I told my men to hold, and I vouched for you because Harrison vouched for you, but in my own heart, I thought we were dead. I thought Base was telling us a story to keep us fighting, and I decided I'd rather die fighting on a lie than give up on the truth. That's where I was." His voice was steady now, the emotion channeled into something clear and hard. And then the shot came. From that tower. From exactly where Base said it would come. Exactly where those people swore nobody would be. And I felt the whole battle change in a single second, felt the thing that had been squeezing us for 6 hours just come apart. And I understood right then, flat on my belly in that hole, that the story was true. That there really was one person up there, and that one person had just done what 3 rescue attempts in a whole command staff couldn't. And I have spent 2 years, ma'am, trying to understand how one person does that. And I finally figured it out, and that's the other thing I came to tell you. Tell me. You didn't save us with the rifle, Ruiz said. The rifle was the last 5%. You saved us in the command tent in 11 minutes with a headset and a map when you heard something in our voices that told you the truth about what was happening to us. Everybody thinks the shot saved us. The shot didn't save us, ma'am. Understanding saved us. You understood us better than we understood ourselves. You heard Sergeant, you heard the man on the radio stop in the middle of a sentence because he felt eyes on the back of his neck, and everyone else wrote it off his nerves, and you heard the truth in it. That's what saved us, not the 50 caliber. The listening. He met her eyes. And I've carried that for 2 years, and I've tried to be a leader who listens hard enough to hear the truth in his people's voices, and I've gotten better at it. And every Marine under Menani is better off because 2 years ago, a captain listened to my voice on a tape and heard something worth climbing a tower for. So that's the last thing. You didn't just save 14 lives. You changed the way I lead, and that means you've touched every man who's ever going to serve under me and every man who serves under them. It doesn't stop at 14, ma'am. It was never going to stop at 14. Evelyn Carter looked at the gunnery sergeant standing in her doorway, and she understood that he had just handed her the thing that Harrison had tried to hand her 2 years before, and she hadn't fully been able to receive, because 2 years before she'd still been thinking in terms of the 14. Harrison had told her it wasn't 14, it was the whole command tent. It was warmer than she could see from the tower. And now Ruiz was telling her it wasn't even that it had never been a number at all. That the things she'd done on the ridge had gone out into the world like a stone into water, and the ripples had not stopped and would not stop, would keep moving through every Marine Ruiz ever led and every Marine they ever led out and out. A widening ring of consequence from one captain who listened to a tape and heard the truth. You know, she said it finally, I told a major 2 years ago that people are starving to be seen accurately. That you tell a person the true good thing about themselves that nobody else bothered to notice, and you've done more for them than a medal. I've spent my whole career doing that for other people, taking the weight off, handing them back their own worth. She looked at Ruiz, and in all that time, nobody ever did it for me, until the ridge, until a sergeant stood at the foot of my bed and told me 14 men would say my name to their kids. And now you've come back 2 years later and told me it never stopped at 14, that it went out into the world and kept going. Her voice was steady, but there was something enormous underneath it. You just did for me what I've spent 20 years doing for everyone else. You saw me accurately, and you told me the true thing, and you have no idea, Gunny, no idea in the world, what that's worth to a person who spent 2 decades being invisible. Ruiz came the rest of the way into the room, and he did a thing that no rank structure quite has a protocol for, which was that he came to attention in front of a wounded captain in a bed, sharp and full and formal, the salute of a man honoring not a rank but a person, and he held it. Ma'am, he said, on behalf of 14 Marines, one of whom is naming his daughter after you, and every Marine who'll ever serve under any of us, and every life that fans out from the 14 you pulled off that ridge, thank you. For understanding us when nobody else could. For climbing a tower everybody called a grave. For finishing the shot with the bullet in you, for waving off your own rescue so nobody else would get hurt. And for being, when you walked into that command tent, carrying nothing but a rifle case and a truth exactly the warrior we needed, even though not one person in that tent had the sense to see it. It was the honor of my life to be one of the 14, and I will carry your name, and I will teach your lesson until the day I die. And Evelyn Carter, Echo 7, the ghost who saved people and disappeared, the invisible captain who had made her peace with never knowing the after, sat in her bed with 2 years of hidden loneliness, finally fully answered, and returned the salute of the sergeant she had saved, and the two of them held it. And the moment did not need words, because everything that mattered had already been said. The story spread in the end as far as a classified story can spread, which is further than the people who classify things ever expect. It moved through the channels that secrecy can't close, the ones made of soldiers, telling soldiers the ones made of lessons taught and retaught, the ones made of a major who never again let a young officer believe they could read a warrior's worth off their appearance. It moved through a gunnery sergeant who led by listening, and through every Marine he ever led. It moved through a girl named Eve who grew up asking why and getting the answer, the parts of it that could be told. It moved through a command tent full of men who had watched a stranger walk in out of the dark and turn certain death into 14 lives, and who never any of them forgot it. And the man who had thrown a radio slip on a table and demanded they send a real warrior spent the rest of his career teaching young soldiers the truest thing he ever learned, which was that a real warrior almost never looks the way you expect, and that the person you are most tempted to underestimate is very often the only one who truly understands how to bring everyone home. Because courage does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in silently, carrying almost nothing, saying almost nothing, and it listens to the voices everyone else ignored, and it hears the truth, and it climbs the tower everyone else called a grave, and it holds the line no one believed could be held. Evelyn Carter was that warrior. She was underestimated, and she was doubted, and she was mocked in front of 40 men before she ever fired a shot. And when the night was over, 14 Marines were alive. A proud man was forever changed. A little girl carried her name into a future she would never see. And every single person who had ever laughed at the quiet captain with the rifle case understood beyond any doubt that would ever trouble them again exactly what a warrior truly is. The doubters were wrong. The silent girl was the strongest one in the valley, and she brought every last one of them home.